It's a well-known fact that President Trump likes strongman leaders, and there was every sign until recently that that extended to India's Narendra Modi. And there was every strategic reason for the US to get along with India as well, since it was seen by many as an important emerging counterweight to China. So a highly important relationship then, you would think. And so it seemed. Modi was there as an honoured guest in the Oval Office way back in February, one of the first world leaders to be there, back in the innocent times, before we'd learned that such events could turn into a highly public struggle session. And yet, suddenly it all went horribly wrong. And India now has the dubious honour of being one of the most heavily tariffed countries in the world by President Trump, an honour that it shares only with Brazil. Why did this happen? And more importantly, how will the consequences play out as the world order is being rapidly reshaped in reaction to the Trump administration? Well, let's discuss. So officially, Trump slapped a 25% tariff on India because the country had not successfully concluded an outline trade deal with the United States before the deadline was reached. And then he slapped an additional 25% tariff on top of that, which was claimed to be punishment for buying Russian oil, bringing the total to 50%, a huge blow to the Indian economy. There's some grounds for believing that these were not the real reason, at least not the sole reason. The trade tariff probably was in line with what might have been expected. The Trump administration's trade negotiators have been consistently seeking massively one-sided deals, according to the countries that they've been dealing with. They mostly got those deals over the line because they were pushing countries that were heavily exposed to the US market, that would suffer significant damage if they were shut out of that market overnight. And so there was a significant power disparity, and those countries didn't feel that they could fight back. But the Americans struggled more with countries that refused, either as a matter of strategy, occasionally also just self-respect. Refused to bow to what was widely perceived to be arrogant bullying. So China was one of those. Canada was another. Brazil as well. The other was India. Now, India was open to negotiating a trade deal, just not a surrender. And in particular, India has always sought to protect its small rural workers, the farmers, the small dairy industry and others. And so it's always been extremely careful and cautious about how and on what basis its markets are opened up. So, for instance, India recently agreed a trade deal with the United Kingdom. A normal trade deal, worked out in great detail over years, careful attention to make sure that unintended negative consequences were being avoided. In other words, seeking to exercise for its own workers the same sort of support and protection that Trump is now seeking to introduce for America. Trump seems only to see that as valid when he does it. When anyone else does it, they're ripping off America. So that was always likely to go somewhat south, in spite of Trump's previous good relationship with Modi. Now, of course, Trump claims good relationships with all sorts of people, even while he's hitting them in the face with outsized and aggressive punishments. But there's another edge in this one, because Trump is showing the signs of being angry at a much more personal level. He started tweeting about India being a dead economy and being aggressively rude about it, and this came soon after India had recently clashed with Pakistan. Following the terrorist attack in Kashmir that killed 26 people, India had struck against targets in Pakistan that it had identified as being connected to the attack. That prompted a response by Pakistan, a brief conflict with fighter aircraft, small arms fire between troops on the ground, and it was quickly de-escalated. And Trump just as quickly swooped in to take the credit, saying that his team had been mediating between the two sides. When Trump boasts that he solved 6 wars, this conflict is one of the ones that he's claiming. The thing is that India said that Trump had nothing to do with it, pointedly refused to give him the credit. And that was possibly the big insult, the tipping point. Because we've seen in recent days how Trump land is supposed to work. We saw the leaders of Ukraine and various other European powers in the White House. I think Zelensky of Ukraine thanked Trump more than a dozen times in 5 minutes. Because, of course, he'd found out the hard way what happens if you don't. And all the others had to obsequiously give Trump credit for all sorts of things just in order to keep him from going off the rails for the length of a meeting. Yes, astonishing, absurd, that the leader of a superpower is so fragile he needs to have praise heaped upon him just to stop him from having a tantrum, so that you can have a whole meeting to discuss an issue. But this is where we are. It's not the first time in history, I suppose, that one man's ego has been a major factor in some globally significant outcome. But not everyone is up for the debasement. Certain leaders are happy to be friendly, sure, to be complimentary in a kind of normal way, just not to play along with a charade. And it turns out that India's Narendra Modi is one of those. No, India was not going to join its enemy Pakistan, which clearly enjoyed trolling its larger neighbour by enthusiastically agreeing with Trump that yes, he'd ended the conflict, and yes, they would be nominating him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Instead, India would treat America with respect, and it expected to be treated with respect in turn. You know, kind of old style. But that is no longer considered sufficient tribute, and it seems that Trump, who has repeated his claim about the India-Pakistan conflict numerous times since, took considerable offence at being contradicted. And so the interest in negotiating trade with India dropped far down the priority list. And so suddenly the only move Trump has made to date to punish any country at all in relation to Russia's war in Ukraine is targeted at India. Not Russia, not China, but India. The punishment of India for buying Russian oil does seem pretty unfair, even to those who absolutely think Russia needs to be getting hit far more effectively than they are now. India did become the single largest buyer of Russian oil after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It now makes up just under 50% of its crude oil, 10 times more than when it was started. And of course it benefited from the fact that Russia was forced to cut its energy prices as it tried to find new markets, with the Europeans reducing their dependency. So that was a commercial decision as far as that went. And it's been claimed that India was even encouraged to do this when the war kicked off, because it was thought that if they didn't, it would be inflationary on the world price of energy. Because you'll recall, that was pushing sky high already. There was a major energy crisis in the world, with all the countries competing for non-Russian energy sources overnight, hence those sources being in short supply. But of course, all such trade-offs come with a cost. It rather defeated some of the point of the sanctions against Russia, since Moscow was still getting revenues for its oil, albeit at a lower price. And India was critiqued as well for the fact that some of that oil was being refined and then exported from India to the very countries that were boycotting Russian oil at source. Scott Bessent was on American television just a few days ago, pointing to that and saying that India had been profiteering. Of course, India is not the only consumer of Russian oil. China is another major buyer, but then also Turkey and Japan and Brazil. Of course, various European countries still get some that have not yet been able to replace that with other sources. So why India and not China, or indeed Turkey or anyone else? There's no particular reason connected purely to volumes, nor is it anything to do with a technicality of the detail of international law, as if such a thing would have any weight with Trump anyway. Instead, it really comes down to political equations, starting with the Trump team's understanding that China has very strong leverage to fight back against hostile measures, thanks to its stranglehold on the supply of rare earth minerals. And also, the US economic system is actually so embedded with China's that, unlike most of its other targets, it is vulnerable itself to the disruption of a trade flow, just as China is. They're working on that, but they seem disinclined to make it even harder for themselves by bringing Russian oil into the equation. But with India, they note that while it's a growing power on the world stage, the US is its biggest export market. Its growth is significantly fueled by American technology and investment. So, of course, Trump's sharks think they can push India around. So far, however, India has refused to play the victim. Partly this comes down to the long-running close partnership India has had with Putin's Russia, and the real cost there would be to ending it abruptly. For example, India's military equipment, more than 60% of which is currently reported to be Russian or even Soviet in origin. Russia remains a key military supplier, notwithstanding its own needs for fighting a war, and of course it sells weapons with few, if any, restrictions on how those weapons can be used. Unlike would be the case if they were buying American weapons, for instance. But in any case, if 60% of your existing stock comes from one source, cutting that relationship off would very quickly leave you with redundant and unusable equipment, needing replacement at higher volumes and higher cost. Secondly, India is always balancing its strategic relationships against the power of its neighbour China, and growing and somewhat tense rivalry between them. Something that, until recently, it also believed was being achieved through a close relationship with the United States. Now, with Trump buddying up with Pakistan and turning on Modi, there has started to be renewed diplomatic efforts between India and China. Because yes, of course, China is seeing Trump's tariff wars as a huge opportunity to extend its role and influence as the up-and-coming global power. So Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was visiting New Delhi this week, meeting with Modi, amongst others, seeking to repair and improve relations. That relationship with China won't be transformed overnight, for sure, but Trump's actions have questioned Modi's previous policy of remaining equidistant between emerging competing powers. And if Trump is going to take against Modi personally, with the ongoing vindictiveness of which he's capable, well, things could change significantly. Either way, there's no doubt that Modi had trusted Trump. He even broke with protocol and did a campaign spot for him in his 2019 re-election campaign. And he was clearly delighted to see him back in the White House in 2024, believing that their personal chemistry would mean it would continue to be a beneficial relationship for the two countries. Whatever happens in the future, that trust is clearly gone. Modi has discovered that Trump's America doesn't do alliances. It will hit you hard the second it thinks it has leverage over you, just because it can. And because it doesn't value all of that soft power stuff that values human relationships and loyalties or any of that. In the meantime, Modi's gone public thanking, quote, my friend President Putin for calling him to share his insights on his summit meeting with Trump in Alaska. Would have been fascinating to have been listening in on that particular call. But of course, the public acknowledgement was sending a message more to Washington, D.C. than it really was to Moscow. The message being that no, India is not going to follow Trump's orders on who it can and can't be friends with. As the consequences of Trump's America alone foreign policy continue to play out, expect this to become a louder and more assertive pushback, and probably from various directions across the world. It's all going to turn out to be rather important on how the coming geopolitical changes play out as the American empire continues its rapid decline and the multipolar world, with all its volatility, rises to the fore.